Good evening, traveler. You've wandered into myth-taken dreams, a place where timelines tangle, truths wobble, and bedtime stories rewrite history just enough to make it magical. Each tale unfolds from a library that never existed, where historians whisper with poets and facts arrive fashionably late. Tonight, we unspool another tale from the flickering archive because bedtime deserves a version of history to pique the imagination. So fluff your pillow, turn down the logic, and lean into the lore. Once upon a time, in a far-flung corner of the world, where the air smelled a bit like burnt toast and the sun liked to pretend it was on a constant vacation, there was a small group of very confused creatures. Now, these creatures weren't exactly stupid. Oh no, they were clever enough to avoid getting eaten and make sure they had enough berries and nuts to eat. But they weren't exactly genius either. They weren't the kind of creatures who would come up with the idea of building a spaceship or inventing pizza. In fact, their greatest achievement so far had been discovering that using a stick to poke things was fun. These creatures were called hominids, and they looked a bit like us, but not exactly like us. They had big eyebrows, muscles that looked like they'd been built by the same people who design bulldozers, and they were generally very good at running away from things that wanted to eat them. Which, if you think about it, is a pretty good skill to have when the world is full of giant, hungry predators. Now, the world was a bit of a rough place back then. It was like being at the world's biggest buffet where every dish was trying to kill you. The sky was full of "I'm going to eat you" storms. The ground was full of "I'm going to eat you" animals, and there was an alarming shortage of comfortable places to sit down. It wasn't a place where anyone could afford to sit around thinking too much. But then, one day, something curious happened. The first Homo sapiens, let's call them the big thinkers, decided that maybe, just maybe, it was time for a little more than running and poking things with sticks. Maybe it was time to ask questions. They gathered around the fire, which, by the way, was the ancient version of "let's meet at the coffee shop and talk about the world." And one particularly bold big thinker said, "What if, and hear me out, we could figure out how to make the world a little less terrifying?" This suggestion was met with a few raised eyebrows, and I mean raised. They were very good at it back then. Another big thinker, who had just recently discovered that you could use rocks to crack open things that were delicious inside, spoke up. "I think that's a great idea. But, how do we do that? More rocks." And that, my friends, is when the real magic started. The big thinkers didn't have the answers, but they had something better. They had ideas. They had the ability to look at the world and say, "I wonder how things work." And then, instead of just shrugging and running away, they decided to figure it out. They spent hours making funny noises at each other until they eventually invented something called language. It wasn't a perfect language, mind you. Most of it was gestures, grunts, and pointing at things while making very meaningful faces. The more the big thinkers thought, the more they did. They figured out how to make better tools, tools that didn't just poke things but could cut and scrape and make things happen. They figured out that fire wasn't just a nice thing to sit around, but also extremely useful for cooking food and keeping things away that might eat you. And, as they got better at understanding the world, they also started making plans. Plans. Plans were big at this point. It was like suddenly realizing you don't have to just wing it all the time. At this point, the other creatures on the planet were looking around at these odd, upright beings and thinking, "What's going on over there? Why are they always huddled together talking and not running away from things? This can't be good." And the big thinkers, knowing they had a lot of work ahead of them, said, "Right, let's get this together. Let's make some real changes." They started organizing, building shelters, and yes, occasionally making silly mistakes, like trying to use giant bones as chairs and wondering why they kept falling over. But they kept going. Now, for a while, it wasn't smooth sailing. Oh no, there were misunderstandings. There were things like, I'm pretty sure we're supposed to be friends, followed by, no, I think we're supposed to not be friends, usually involving some kind of sharp, pointy stick. But eventually, they began to work together. They came up with ideas about how to work with the land, how to work with animals, and, more importantly, how to work with each other. And so, slowly but surely, the big thinkers started to change everything. They invented art, which, let's face it, is a very good way of saying this is what I'm thinking, but in a much cooler way. They started making better tools, building villages, and even developing the most powerful concept of all. We can do it together. Which, by the way, was the very first team-building exercise, long before it became trendy in modern offices. And while all this was happening, the world was still full of strange, new ideas and untried experiments. After all, just because you figured out how to make fire doesn't mean you figured out how to make a pizza. That took some time, but we got there. And that, dear reader, is how Homo sapiens came to be. Not by being the biggest or the strongest, but by being the most curious, the most creative, and the most determined to figure out how the world worked. Because, in the end, it wasn't about being the fastest or the toughest. It was about asking the one question that's been keeping us going ever since. What if we could do this better? And, just like that, humans began to change the world one idea at a time. The end, or rather the beginning, again.